Imagine for a moment that the year is 1962. There's no Snapchat, no TikTok, no Reddit, no Instagram. If you're lucky, your family has a typewriter, and perhaps one phone for you and your siblings to share. As for the country, the young John F. Kennedy is the President of the United States, and tensions between the US and the self-proclaimed Marxist-Leninist Fidel Castro post the Cuban Revolution are escalating. And all the while, the US is preparing to do things like put a man on the moon. The Soviets, meanwhile, across the ocean, were testing nuclear weapons. We knew this from intelligence, but we had no idea how, when, or where exactly they were going to be firing them. And perhaps worst of all, these intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, could potentially reach the United States. Now I want you to pause your game of Fortnite for a moment and really imagine this. Imagine your family's phone rings and it's the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or XCOM. Well, it turns out you're quite the whiz kid at math and science, and the federal government has taken notice. They need your help. The problem? The government's early warning defensive radar systems, as powerful as they are, operate only by line of sight. The Earth, however? Well, as you may or may not believe, the Earth is round. Therefore, this presented a problem in which the United States could only see a few hundred miles off its coastline. By the time our defensive capabilities realized an ICBM was headed our way, it could potentially be far too late in the timeline to properly neutralize the threat. While satellite technology was evolving at an ever-increasing pace, it would be years before a reliable satellite constellation was properly put into orbit. And as for flying reconnaissance aircraft over Soviet territory, it was far too risky and far too spotty. So indeed, the question remained, how on earth, quite literally, can we monitor Soviet missile technology from home? On this edition of Low Altitude, I'm going to be describing to you one of the most brilliantly mind-boggling yet eerily simple technologies to perhaps ever come out of the 20th century, perfected during a time of unprecedented suspicion and paranoia across the globe. A technology that will forever hold its place as one of the largest pieces of communication networking on the planet, all while being entirely powered by the sun. Indeed, a technology that turned out to be one of the most understated allies of both the United States and the Soviet Union alike during those ominous times of the Cold War. I'm LO, and this is Low Altitude. Join me on this week's edition as I discuss one of the most underappreciated telecommunications technologies of all time, a technology that literally is above our heads. The ionosphere. So right now I'm taking a drive up to a hill. If you guys can tell, this road is very hilly. And I'm coming to you from Long Island, New York. We're here in Suffolk County, and the interesting thing about Long Island is that it's actually known for being somewhat flat. There's not a lot of interesting topography. However, there are some areas that are notably pretty hilly, and I'm headed up to a hill called Telescope Hill. All the glacial stuff was basically pushed into these gigantic piles that became these hills, and hence the Ronkonkoma moraine. Now, the reason why this is relevant is because on top of these hills are some of the tallest radio towers on Long Island, and that's where we're headed right now. Now, as I said, we're sort of at the top of a hill, and we're at one of the highest elevations in all of Suffolk County. So one of the questions that you may wonder is, obviously, why is that tower built on this hill? And you'll find that, wow, that's interesting. There's another one down there, another tower down that way. But you'll find that throughout radio and telecommunications engineering, that's a really common theme. You're gonna build towers on hills, and the towers are gonna be as high as they possibly can go. The reason why this is is because most radio is, as I alluded to in the intro, line of sight. In other words, basically, the radio can only go as far as it can quote-unquote see. And honestly, that means that for most people at ground level, you're not going to go very far. However, what it also means is that if you get a tower that's high enough, you can quote-unquote see further. And really, that's basically how it works. It's just, whoa, this is a big hill. Woo! Got little butterflies in that one. Interesting to know that Long Island actually has a really, really big history in defensive strategy for the US, specifically because it's located to the east of New York City. And so this place has been used for all sorts of reconnaissance and essentially early warning systems. Actually, right up here near where Telescope Hill is located, where those towers are, they used to have a lookout. You could basically see to the Atlantic Ocean from up there. Of course, if you guys are interested in some more interesting things having to do with the history of Long Island and their surveillance, look up Camp Hero, which is out in Montauk. And actually to this day, there's a massive radar dish that's still standing. There's actually a bunch of videos of people who have gone into that. Do not recommend that, by the way. But the point of this here is to demonstrate that yes, we are in the highest, hilliest area of this island, and there are radio towers everywhere. Hello everybody and welcome to another edition of Low Altitude. I'm your host, LO, coming to you from a Cold War era bunker. No, I'm kidding. But I am here to talk to you about something very interesting to me, and maybe to you as well. HF, or high frequency radio. Why it's important, how does it affect aviation, why should I care? And then, more specifically, talk about what makes this cool and why you should know about it. So if you guys haven't watched my first video in this series, Low Altitude, here on YouTube, also on Instagram, I suppose I'll upload this too there. But I highly recommend you do so because I kind of describe the difference between AM, amplitude modulation, and FM, frequency modulation. And really, they're just different ways of encoding data onto a carrier frequency, carrier wave. But I also mentioned how I was going to be describing what HF radio is and specifically what makes it so strange, because really there's a lot of weirdness to this stuff. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, a lot of it played a very important pivotal moment in the history of the 20th century. One of the biggest things to realize here is that for most of the radio spectrum and radio that you'll experience throughout your career, maybe a hobby, walkie-talkie, aircraft, Wi-Fi, I'll be talking about that in a second. But for most of that stuff, it's what's called line of sight. And so as I described up on the hill, line of sight means that you're basically only able to transmit as far as you could quote-unquote see. The higher you go, the further you can see, and the further you can theoretically transmit. It's really no different than my cat when she climbs her cat tree so she can see all the squirrels and birds out my backyard. Of course, I think she also does it to mock me and, taunt me every day, but that's a different story. We love you, Kika. But now, enter HF. HF, by the way, high frequency, is defined by having a frequency of 3 to 30 megahertz. What makes these frequencies unique, though, is that they have a tendency to behave a little bit differently in certain parts of the atmosphere. Most notably, as I mentioned in the beginning, one layer of the atmosphere that's super important to radio is what is known as the ionosphere. And this is named that way, by the way, because of ions. The sun is charging the layers of this ionosphere, which make it do weird things to certain types of frequencies, most notably the ones in the HF spectrum. Now, the reason why I wanted to mention Wi-Fi is because this is a great example of something I think most of us have experienced. Have you guys ever heard of 5 gigahertz or 5G Wi-Fi? Now, I have the two networks here, and I love the 5G because it's faster. I can stream 4K, it's just much easier to work with. But there is one major problem with 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi versus the other conventional 2.4 gigahertz. The problem is that 5 is more than 2.4. The problem is that 5 gigahertz does not have the same range as the lower frequency 2.4. Wait a minute, low frequency, you said. Think about it. 5 gigahertz has much higher bandwidth. You're able to send more information over a given time period, but it doesn't reach as far. It's because the high frequencies are absorbed by things and walls and ceilings and people much easier. If you want to impress somebody at the bar this weekend, you can say that the frequencies are attenuated. By the way, the exact same thing applies to vibrational frequency, which is what sound is, music. If you guys have a party down the street, you're probably not going to be, hearing the treble. You're hearing the bass. Again, bass, low frequency, it's penetrating walls, it's pushing stuff around, it's harder to absorb. I mean, that's really what it is. In fact, in audio engineering, we use what are called bass traps to properly acoustically treat a room. And usually these are placed in areas where bass, quote unquote, collects, most notably the corners of the room. You usually see bass traps applied and stacked in a corner of a room. I have them up in my room upstairs, and they make a huge difference. So with this in mind, we kind of come to this conclusion. I mean, it's kind of a crude one, but we can say that lower frequencies propagate further. They're able to basically push stuff around easier, and they're able to not be absorbed. And that's actually the exact same thing that happens with HF radio. Now, the ionosphere is a part of the atmosphere that, like I said, is charged by the sun. And so what this means is that, well, at night, some layers are not being charged. And now I'm not going to get too detailed into the different layers of the ionosphere, but mostly what happens is that when the sun charges them, they either propagate stuff or they attenuate it. They either bounce it off and carry it further, or they get rid of it. That's a good way to think of it. At night, a lot of this stuff actually is not attenuated, it's not suppressed, and it skips, it bounces. That's called Skywave, and it's what makes the ionosphere famous. It's like shooting up a radio wave in the HF band or lower, and it bounces off the ionosphere onto some other area of the planet. And in fact, most people do actually know this. They just don't realize they know it. Have you ever been driving around at night, AM radio, and you turn on your AM radio and you're like, holy shit, like why am I getting Cleveland, Ohio? I'm in Saratoga Springs, New York. Now, by the way, day and night aren't the only things that affect the ionosphere, and the seasons play a major role too, because recall what the seasons are. It's basically just a changing of the way that the sun is shining onto the earth. So there are certain layers of the ionosphere that are charged and not charged and propagate and attenuate based on day, based on night, and also based on the time of year. For me, upstate New York in late summer, those were the nights that you could really hear a lot of the AM commercial stations from the Midwest, Ohio, Kansas, Oklahoma. They would sometimes come in crystal clear. In fact, this is such a well-known thing that many AM stations are required to turn down their transmission power at night simply because if they left it on the daytime level, they'd drown out half the globe. There was a radio station, WLW. If you guys ever get bored, look it up, WLW. It was like 500,000 watts or something. And this thing quite literally covered from like Hawaii to Portugal. I mean, absolutely unbelievable. So at this point, you sort of understand the difference between high and low frequencies and how that's affecting its ability to propagate or be absorbed, attenuated. And you also know some of the basics of the ionosphere. So recall radar. Radar, usually VHF or UHF, or maybe it's microwave, whatever it's using, the frequency generally is going to be line of sight. And of course, that means that you're only as good as you can see. That's why, like in the beginning of this video, I demonstrated most towers and transmitters are high up on a hill or on a tower. It's like no different than my cat. She wants to have a big line of sight and see all the little critters and birds that are in the yard, and she also climbs the thing to piss me off, but that's a different story. The cat is increasing her line of sight. It's no different than a transmitter. The problem, though, in the Cold War was that we had these ICBMs that were capable of, total annihilation, and we needed to know exactly when they were launched. And by the way, I'm sure the Soviets were interested in the same stuff that we were doing. So the question that both sides had to sort of figure out is, how do we see beyond that horizon? And so now you can kind of see how I'm bringing this all together here. You have HF radio, the ionosphere, able to bounce stuff off of it and propagate information, propagate a signal. And you also have radar that is basically limited by the fact that it's only line of sight. Ta-da! Combine them up, you have what is known as an over-the-horizon radar system, and that is pretty much how it works. Now, there was a really powerful Soviet radar system called the Duga-3, and you guys should look this up sometime and read about it because it's really fascinating. This thing came onto the scene in the late 70s, and immediately people were like, dude, what is this? TVs were affected. HF radio for airliner communication was affected. I'll be talking about that. Telephones were affected. All this stuff was being messed up, right? And it's interesting to note that there were actually a bunch of people, ham radio guys, who they knew what it was. They knew it was a Soviet over-the-horizon radar system. They nicknamed it the Russian woodpecker. The reason is because it had a very distinctive sounding baud pulse that sounded like, and they thought it sounded like a woodpecker. And everyone started calling this thing a woodpecker. But the interesting part about these ham radio guys is that they were kind of clever and they didn't like the Soviets very much. So what they did is they actually took a recording of those baud pulses and then they shot it back towards the Soviet Union. Now, if you understand the basics of how radar works, I'm not going to get into it in this video. It's far too digressing to do that. But the basis is that you're just looking for stuff to be reflected back and comparing it and seeing essentially what's coming back to the radar. And so when you send back the identical signal that you received to the radar operator, I mean, I would imagine the whole scope kind of lights up and it's just like, oh my God, you know, what's going on? Like either that or the thing broke, like the antenna fell over, you know? And so these guys who were effectually these, I'm assuming maybe drunk and high, just having a good time in their backyard ham shacks in the late 70s, sending back data to the Soviets that they had recorded from recordings of their over-the-horizon radar system. And they were actually getting the Soviets to change frequencies, to change the baud rate, to change upper and lower sidebands. That's getting way out of the scope of what I'm talking about. But essentially, they really pissed them off. And it's fascinating because these dudes, or like I said, they're a bunch of just like, you know, these Southern guys who they just really didn't like the Soviets very much. And they were sending back information to them and pissing them off. And it's interesting if you look up, I think it's called the Russian Woodpecker Hunting Club or Hunting Association. That is a true story. And man, you'll never hear about that in school. You know, and sometimes, you know, the Russian woodpecker, maybe it would come in and be crystal clear and you can hear it. Other times you couldn't hear it at all. A lot of this is actually affected by the sun, because like I said, the sun charges the ionosphere. Obviously seasons, obviously day and night affects it, but also the sun, not unlike the Earth and other planets, has weather, space weather. It's really a thing. And the sun throws off certain sun flares, solar flares. You know, you get these coronal mass ejections that bombard all the solar system with tons of radiation and different interference. And really, this makes a big difference in how the ionosphere is what they call excited. It's in an excited state, and that could affect how things are propagating or not. And one of the things that a lot of people don't often realize is that, you know, the HF band is completely dependent on the fact that the sun could really mess it up or make it work awesome. So naturally, HF tends to be a little bit rough around the edges because you're so dependent on such a natural thing, the sun. I mean, you know, clearly the sun can affect it pretty badly if it's having a bad solar flare. Back in 2012, there was actually a major solar flare that just happened to miss the Earth, and all these scientists and engineers were convinced that if that had hit the Earth, it would have fried a bunch of our satellites and perhaps knock out a lot of our electrical grids. These are like real concerns, and it sounds like, again, that, you know, you'd be wearing the tinfoil hat to say this stuff without evidence that the sun is going to fry a bunch of our power grid, but it's completely true. And proper shielding from solar flares is a big part of the power grid system. So we kind of understand the basis of why over-the-horizon radar was important, especially during the Cold War, because both sides had to know, with a really early warning detection, when the missiles were coming. And over-the-horizon radar was really the main way they were able to make that happen up until surveillance from satellite. And like I said in the beginning, it was really nowhere near ready at the time when this threat was really a real thing. But eventually it was, and satellites tended to be a lot easier to deal with, and like I said, they're not as affected by things like ionospheric propagation, which can be controlled by the sun. So eventually they kind of went by the wayside. But we're seeing kind of a resurgence now with HF. They use it to monitor ship traffic and monitor the islands and monitor movements along certain large areas of water, for instance. Now, turning the tide to HF communication, one of the things that notoriously uses HF is oceanic control. And oceanic air traffic control uses it to basically, well, talk over long distances. It's how it works. Like I said, it's able to bounce off the ionosphere. You know, like everything else during the solar events, you may have to change frequency more often. And it's really weird too, because sometimes in one area of the ocean, it would work perfectly, and in the other area, everything is unusable. For those of you wondering, by the way, because I know I'm going to get questions on this because you guys are like even nerdier than me, but at least in New York Center where I originally was training, the way that those HF operators work is that they're actually sent computerized instruction from the air traffic controller, and then the HF operator themselves communicate to the pilot. The reason why is because HF radio, as you probably have gotten the gist of from this video, is potentially pretty nasty to work with. You need somebody who's able to really know what they're doing on the radio transceiver. And it's not to say that controllers don't know what they're doing, but it is to suggest that they have other stuff to do. They can't be worrying about sunspots and worrying about tuning a sideband. And so for that reason, they have dedicated positions of HF radio operators that talk to the pilots and then relay the information to and from the air traffic controller. Again, another thing most people have no idea about that's just blatantly fascinating to me. So kind of cool. Anyway, in summary, HF radio, which is defined by 3 to 30 megahertz, is really fascinating. And it does not behave like other bands of the RF spectrum. As we've discussed, the biggest takeaway here is that most radio is line of sight. And so if you want to get a further distance from your transmission, you have to go further up on the Earth. Airplanes, well, that's no problem. They're up miles and miles in the sky. But for a ground-based transmitter, could be a bigger problem. And so that's why they build them on hills. We talked about different frequencies and how low frequencies tend to not be absorbed so easily, and in fact, sometimes they can propagate very far. Think about bass. Think about the low frequency of your Wi-Fi. 5 gigahertz, it's faster, it has more bandwidth, it's more modern, but doesn't have the same range as 2.4, the older stuff. We talked about the ionosphere, how it's affected by the sun, and specifically what it does to high frequency radio. We also mentioned how high-frequency radio and the ionosphere could be combined to combat the ever-famous problem of radar not being able to see over the horizon. I discussed with you the famous Russian woodpecker that unfortunately also introduced interference to most of the Western world. But the bottom line is that it's really fascinating, and I think that this is stuff most people don't know about. So while it's true technology will always continue to evolve, most of the oceanic systems now for air traffic control are being replaced by satellite, ADS-C, ADS-B, CPDLC, data link, all these things. I'll probably get into eventually because people apparently are interested in this stuff. I don't know why. You guys need lives. No, I'm just kidding. But one of the things to think about is just the appreciation of how far technology has come and the cultivation of all these different paradigms and technologies and all these different studies coming together. And that's really what I love about this stuff. It's because, you know, I can talk about music and talk about bass and talk about the sun and talk about how the Soviets wanted to see and we wanted to see them. I mean, that's amazing. And really, the more you learn, the more you realize how intertwined it all really is. But that's a discussion for another day. As always, guys, thank you so much for joining me on today's edition of Low Altitude when I discussed the ionosphere and how HF radio plays a big part in it. If you like this video, please like, share, subscribe. As always, guys, LO@aviationlowdown.com. Send me some love, send me some hate mail, and everything in between. Go out and, well, have a good time. Don't do anything I wouldn't do. And remember, use the word attenuate at the bar. I'm telling you, people will be impressed. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.